blood, try to hit me in the gut, thinking that I won't react. You whisper in my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home, begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating yet. My legend's written in the stone, yeah. Your crying nature in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, yeah. First round, fifth round, final round. No, 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 no. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, holding the sound of my name in the crowd. You didn't bust. Oh, 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 oh. You didn't bust. Oh, oh, oh,
Turkey finally drops its objections to Switzerland becoming a member of NATO. The United States approves cluster munitions, which the UN has previously said cannot be used or should not be used by Russia and Moscow. And Ukraine continues to make slow but steady progress in their counteroffensive. This is in time. Oh, dear Lord. Okay. Yeah. Oh, my phone. It's the ambassador from Switzerland calling. Wants to know why I'm saying they're joining NATO. Yeah. Okay. May have been a little bit of a
Swaziland.
It's what exact. Yeah. You know. I mean, they begin with SW.
Some country with SW in the name.
Yeah. What do you think this is? A news channel? You expect accuracy? Give me a fucking break. Oh, thank you all. Welcome to In Time. If you can't laugh at yourself, who can you laugh at? So, minor correction on the preamble there, but thank you all for joining us. We are still optimistic and hopeful that Starsky will join us. He is in Hostomel right now, or last I spoke with him. We spoke earlier today. Mercado Media has decided to go visit in Kyiv. So, Mercado Media is in Kyiv right now, and Starsky's been showing them around today. They decided to do Hostomel, so that's where they've been. Any of you who know the history there, that's a big deal. That's not a small thing. So, Starsky let me know that it'd be about a half hour late. We put the show back a half hour to accommodate that, but we also knew that he may still not make it. So it's been another 10 minutes on top of that. We decided to go. It's important, I think, to keep doing these updates, whether or not Starsky can make it. Obviously, we all want to hear what he has to say. We will see him on the shills tomorrow if he does not make it here. So, and I'm going to try to make it for that too. So, we're still cautiously optimistic. And he literally, I think, last time that he was late, he showed up 5 minutes. We were literally wrapping up. And, but he was good about it and you were good about it. We managed to extend the show a bit because, it was 5 minutes. And I think it's important to hear what he's got to say. But, given that he is not here right now, I think we, should continue with what we can do absent his, expertise being, in the Ukrainian military, right now. So, Commander McMillan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, haven't done this in a while, and I think those of you who have been watching for a while know who you are, but we've got a lot of new members, a lot of new people who are following us, so could you please refresh our memories as to who you are and your background?
Sure. I'm Lance McMillan. I'm a retired U.S. Navy commander. My specialties while I was on service was operational logistics and amphibious operations. I'm a graduate of the War College and of the Staff and Command College. I'm a fully certified Joint Service Officer. I don't know what else to add to that, but I kind of studied military history and observed or been peripherally part of a couple of operations, so I have familiarity to an extent of how ground warfare is conducted.
So can you tell us what's been going on for the last week in Ukraine?
Sure. So let's go back and talk about your goof. Let's get that out of the way. The
Okay.
Turks were satisfied with some promises that the Swedes gave them and removed their objection to Swedish membership in NATO. So it looks like Sweden is now on the fast track to becoming a full member. The objections primarily concerned the fact that Sweden was harboring people that Turkey considers to be terrorists and not prosecuting them. While they were there, they were still actively, engaging on the internet. They were raising funds, which they were then sending back to their groups in Turkey. We know that the Swedes are actually taking active measures to fulfill the promise that they probably made to the Swedes. Nothing has been declared on that front, but that's what the consensus opinion is. And they've actually arrested a couple of people in question. So that's where we stand.
All right. So, not Switzerland. I think that's probably worth getting accurate. So you had mentioned this before. Why there are a number of countries that have now been asking to join NATO since this invasion. You had said previously that this represents a catastrophic strategic blunder on the part of the Russians. Could you tell me, A, why is it such a big strategic blunder? And B, why was, I almost said Switzerland again. Wow. Why was Sweden the most important? You had also said that of all the ones asking to join NATO right now, that are applying and going through, Ukraine is not there yet. Sweden was the most important. Could you tell me why?
The biggest reason is that Sweden has a fairly robust defense industry of its own, and it has a fairly robust military of its own. They've been exercising on occasion with various NATO members, but never as a part of NATO, so they're not integrated. They'll do exercises with the Danes or with the Norwegians or what have you, but never all of them together. They can now start doing that, developing common doctrine and communications protocols. So all of that's important because it brings a significant boost to the force structure of NATO in the northern tier and gives them a lot more force that they can bring to bear against the Russians should it ever come to it in the Baltic. So that's significant. The second reason is that it puts pretty much all of Europe in a block that says we don't like Russia and we want them to stop doing the crap that they're doing. Whereas without people in NATO, even if they voice an objection to the invasion of Ukraine, it's an individual voice from a relatively small country. But when it's part of that larger agglomeration, it has more gravitas, if you will.
And is that why, in your view, this was a strategic blunder for Putin, the war in the first place? At least one of the reasons.
I think he was hoping that the feelings in NATO over this invasion would kind of divide the alliance. That, some people would say, oh, no, we shouldn't aggravate them. We should, give in to their demands, not supply the Ukrainians because that would be dangerous. It might make them mad and cause an escalation in the conflict. Okay, but the opposite happened. Instead of dividing NATO, it brought everybody together. It brought a lot of countries, Germany, who had been kind of letting their military slack and not putting in the required amount of money that they're supposed to have to maintain their military. So the invasion of Ukraine woke those people up, brought them back actively into the alliance. They're rebuilding their forces. Everybody's aware there's now a real threat in that European theater, which everybody thought when the wall fell in '89 that it was gone and would never come back. Well, it's back. So
we'd asked. Oh, yes. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say that's an important aspect because it puts the alliance on alert that there is still a utility to being a member of NATO. Whereas I suspect a number of parties in the governments of many of the nations were saying, no, it's a waste of our time. We shouldn't be part of NATO. They don't represent our interests, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're going, well, maybe that's a stupid thing to say.
They had Russia had some reason to think that NATO wasn't going to do anything, or any of the member countries were going to do anything, because realistically, when he invaded Crimea, nobody did anything. I'd asked, and you were there for this. We'd asked Lieutenant General Benjamin Hodges, who was the former NATO commander of all NATO ground forces, also the former U.S. commander of all U.S. forces in Europe. We'd asked him about this, and so I wanted to ask you now, especially also given that, by the way, in my view, my understanding was Ukraine was in a very different position then. They hadn't really gotten their military built up. They may not have been in a position to resist a full-fledged invasion where they were now. But with what we know now about what happened in Crimea when Russia invaded, was it a mistake to not involve ourselves at that point?
My personal opinion, yes. I think at that point we should have made at least a unilateral effort, if not a concerted effort with all of NATO, or at least with the EU, to try to bring Ukraine into the defensive fold and make the Russians understand that attacking Ukraine was not going to be tolerated. That didn't happen. I understand why it didn't happen. People were really concerned about pissing off the Russians, about causing escalation. And honestly, there were too many big fish making too much money, and they were influencing the political process in many countries about that.
So, real quick from Sinister Porpoise, a member, what is it? A member message. The Swiss forgive you. Ignore our vaults of Nazi gold. Whew.
Oh,
yeah, spicy. Thank you for that. For the most part, as long as, by the way, we are an educational program. Anyone who wants to share our content can, so long as it's presented genuinely and it's not being misused to misrepresent things. So we had a couple of requests about sharing or streaming the content, and the answer to that in general is yes. But do try to reach me out on Discord and let me know that you've done it. So when we get the appropriate warnings, we can we can deal with that. So thank you for that, and just make sure you reach out to me on Discord at your earliest convenience, and you can do that through our Discord as well. So thank you for that. So what else, Commander, is going on now that we've discussed the
non-Swiss Swedes?
It's not like when you make a mistake, I bring it up every oh, yeah. Yeah, okay.
I never make mistakes. I'm perfect.
Yeah, I may have to
or
walk
as I
that
like
statement
to say,
back.
I know everything, and what I don't know, I make up.
All right. So
anyway, so other things that are going on. The U.S. just approved another aid package, and for the first time, we will be providing Ukraine with cluster munitions. Now, I want to clarify, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians have been using cluster munitions since fairly early on in this conflict. So it's not like we're introducing something new. We're just giving them our version. The big difference is that our cluster munitions have a failure rate of about 3.5%. Russian cluster munitions have a failure rate of somewhere between 35 to 40%. Yeah. So the reason this is important is all these little bomblets lie around after the weapon is used, and people, especially civilians, and really especially little kids, can come along and think, ooh, that's nothing important, I'll just kick it out of the way, and it goes off. For kids, it's especially dangerous because some of them actually look rather like toys, like little, helicopter toys or something. So a child who doesn't know what they're doing is going to go, ooh, look at that, and grab it, and boom. So I'm not a fan of cluster munitions. They have their uses, I understand that, but if you're going to use them, one would hope that you're using ones that are less dangerous to non-combatants rather than ones that are extremely dangerous. That's my view on the topic.
Why are cluster munitions suddenly so important? Why are people talking about it now in regards to Ukraine?
Again, they've already been used multiple times by both sides. The big thing is that cluster munitions give you the ability to take out groups of vehicles and or personnel with a single weapon, as opposed to firing one weapon at one tank or one soldier or what have you. So if you see a column of vehicles or a group of vehicles assembling in a field somewhere, with the right cluster munition, you can fire one shell that will split into the little bomblets, which will home in on those vehicles' heat signatures, and boom, 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 you take out most of the vehicles in said column or assembly area. If you're talking about troops in trenches, where direct fire is going to have a hard time hitting them, where doing damage with artillery or mortars is problematic because you literally have to drop the shell into the trench, which is complicated and difficult to achieve. What you can do is use a cluster munition, which will, because there's so many little warheads coming down, several of them are very likely to drop into the trench and clear the trench, which is your overall objective in the first place.
My understanding is they've also, so one of the reasons they've been going so slow, and I think that's the next thing we're going to talk about, so slow, which is, I think, a relative term, obviously. One of the reasons is because of the heavy mining that they've had to contend with, that Ukraine has had to contend with. And reports that they've been using cluster munitions to deal with that problem. Is that accurate? And is that something that you think is a good idea?
Yeah, we talked about this last week with Starsky. You can, emphasis can, use cluster munitions to try to clear minefields. So this crossroads is mined. So you fire one or two cluster munitions into that area. All the little bomblets fall to earth, and because they haven't hit a target per se, they'll all start going off. The shockwave of that detonation hopefully triggers the mines to go off, thereby clearing the area of mines. The trouble is the cluster munition warheads are arguably not big enough to cause all the mines to detonate. So it's not a very efficient minefield clearing device. There are explosive minefield clearing devices. They're called line chargers, which is kind of an elaborate Bangalore torpedo from World War I thing. But you have to get close to use those kind of things. You're exposing the vehicle launching line charge to enemy anti-tank fire or what have you. So sometimes that cluster munition to clear the minefield is your only option.
All right. So what else is going on in regards to the Ukrainian war for the last week?
Well, not a lot. The Ukrainians are making progress in both the Bakhmut and the Zaporizhia areas. It's not as fast as everybody was hoping would happen, but it is progress and it is gaining ground. The hope is that, sometime soon they will breach the final Russian defense line and allow their forces to exploit through. As somebody noted in one of the discussions on Discord today, the Ukrainians still have not committed the bulk of their reserves. They have arguably about 2 corps worth of troops, all equipped with these new weapons that we've given them, all fully trained, still just waiting. They haven't gone to the front. They're waiting for that breach, that hole in the enemy line to open up so they can burst through.
And they're still essentially, my understanding is, actually have forces in reserve waiting to find where that spot is going to be, and that's just what's been taking longer. Is that roughly accurate? Yeah.
So they're probing, like in Bakhmut or Zaporizhia. They're looking for weaknesses. They're looking for places they can hopefully achieve a breakthrough. They're trying to cause the Russians to shift their reserves to cover those advances, which potentially leaves a weak spot in their line somewhere else because they pulled troops out, and then you can throw the reserves against that part of the line. It's a very involved and complicated process, but the key is that they have reserves that they have not sent into action, which gives them a huge advantage over the Russians, who really don't have a lot of depth of reserve right now.
So we've got a super chat. It's thank you very much. And so it's Gaming with Robin, 15 pounds. As always, all super chats on these shows, whether Starsky makes it or not, if it is our weekly 3 p.m. Eastern show, which is the update with Starsky, whether he's here or not, they all go to the charity of his choice. He has chosen the 𝐍𝐢𝐜𝐴 volunteer organization, which gives money to a number of units and charities in Ukraine. They work directly with the units in Ukraine, including Starsky's unit. So his unit gets funding. They get funding for drones, for armor, for whatever they need directly from the 𝐍𝐢𝐜𝐴 volunteer organization. All super chats, what we get, YouTube does take a cut, unfortunately, but what we get that remains, all of it in its entirety goes to the 𝐍𝐢𝐴 volunteer organization. So we appreciate all the super chats and for these shows. So long as the Ukraine war continues for the Starsky episodes, all of the super chats will go to the 𝐍𝐢𝐴 volunteer organization. So we'd like to thank you all for that. Gaming with Robin, £15. 15 pounds. I keep doing that. Wow. This is definitely an A day for me. €15. And I've done that with Gaming with Robin before, too. Apologies. €15. The Dutch government fell tonight due to them not finding a compromise on certain issues. Could this have an impact on what is happening in Ukraine? I know the Netherlands is supporting Ukraine. So thank you for that, Gaming with Robin. I'd like to make a clarification. If you're an American, when you hear the government fell, it smacks of like coup d'etat or something like this. When you have a parliamentary system, it's a very different thing. So,
yeah, it doesn't involve tanks.
Yes. Okay. So the government has not fallen in the sense that most Americans would think of it, but it has fallen in the way that anybody who has a parliamentary system might consider it. The coalition government that was put together to legislate can no longer function. So this happens from time to time in parliamentary systems. It doesn't mean the government doesn't exist, but it does mean that they can't function until they can get a working coalition together, which is now their number one goal. How will this affect, do you think, Netherlands' support for Ukraine?
I honestly don't know. I was unaware that the Dutch government had changed hands. I don't know which members of the coalition who left were which. So if they were pro-Ukraine and we're going to form a coalition that creates a new government which is mostly neutralist, that's bad for Ukraine. Conversely, if it was the neutrals or pro-Russians who were ejected or walked away, then perhaps you end up getting more pro-Ukrainian people on there, and the country starts giving the Ukrainians more aid. So I can't really say. I don't know enough about Dutch politics.
And to the best of my understanding, it was about most of the collapse had to do with refugees, not with Ukraine per se. So how they reestablish their government, it's very much, if Republicans take the executive branch, the presidency in the U.S., that's going to change things. And if they take more seats in Congress, that's going to change things for the U.S. If they don't, if Democrats hold the executive and take more of the legislative branch, that will also change things. So yeah, any shift in government can change things, but it depends on who comes out on top. So I think that's a good question. This is still breaking. Titan put that in the breaking news on our Discord, so you can look up at that, but this is very new. So I haven't had a chance to get into it. So thank you, Gaming with Robin, for your continued support. You've been a supporter for a while, and we really appreciate that. It's too new for us to really have gotten into it and understand the potential ramifications, but I think you're correct in assuming it has the potential to have significant ramifications in terms of their support. It just depends on how this plays out. My understanding is it's not the central issue behind the breakup of the coalition government. So because of that, it's very hard to say what's going to happen, because the battle lines aren't being drawn there. So we don't know what happens if any given side wins until we really start to research that. So we will get into it. All right. So let's see. We've covered that Sweden is not Switzerland, which I appreciate being educated on that. I kind of, I looked at a map. I thought it was one country divided into, I said, okay, so you learn something new every day. We've covered the cluster. Although I did have one other question. Isn't cluster munitions covered by the Geneva Conventions? So wouldn't that make their use illegal, at least according to the Geneva Conventions anyway? Or are there exceptions? Or how do the Geneva Conventions apply to this issue?
I don't think it's covered in the Geneva Convention. I'm not certain, but if it is, the wording is probably vague enough that they can be used, because not just Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S., but lots of other countries have cluster munitions. It's like mines. There are protocols against mines, yet most countries still maintain inventories of mines.
My understanding is it's actually the same for what is it? Incendiary rounds, which are legal for use under most conditions, but not under some. It depends on how you deploy them. And incendiary rounds can be a violation of the Geneva Conventions, depending on how they're employed. If you use them to deliberately destroy a town by deploying them over that town and they burn through everything in the town, my understanding is that's considered a war crime. If you use them to illuminate a battlefield in the middle of battle, it's not a crime. So you can use them, but the how is as important as the what you're using. So I think that's my understanding, at least on the cluster munitions. So, all right. Ukraine and Russia, that's another no, the U.S. has signed the Geneva Conventions. I assume Russia has. They're not a part of the criminal court, but that's a different thing. All right.
I saw in the chat stream somebody asked about ATACMS.
Please,
they
yes,
have been approved for transfer to the Ukraine, which is nice, but they've been very vague on both delivery date and which model of ATACMS is being sent, because there's considerable difference between the early models and the late models of ATACMS in terms of range. So, yeah, and I'm sure that's probably classified material. So.
All right. So, is there anything else that you can think of? We've seen that bulge just south of the river, and it looks like Ukraine is making progress and hoping to maybe punch through there. But the progress has not been that significant over last week. So, and if there isn't something specific about that progress, what would you be looking for next week as a good sign, and what would you be looking for as a bad sign that would have you concerned?
First, you need to clarify which bulge you're talking about, because there are multiple rivers where the lines are on. I assume you mean on the Dnipro, and
yes.
It's kind of south of Kherson, the little bridgehead that the Ukrainians. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, they had ferried some infantry across who've been sheltering more or less underneath a highway bridge that was going over the river. The bridge is destroyed itself, but the base of the bridge provides overhead cover and is pretty much protecting those guys who were there from Russian artillery fire. The Russians have been lobbing all sorts of, super missiles and artillery at it, but the guys are still there. They sent in an attack column to try to retake that bridgehead and drive the Ukrainians away, and instead they lost several vehicles, both to anti-tank guided missiles carried by the people who are in the bridgehead and from artillery on the opposite shore. So the Ukrainians are clearly in solid communication with the bridgehead. I suspect that they are going to reinforce that bridgehead and try to expand it. But the trouble is, it's very difficult to use that as an avenue for an offensive force to drive towards Crimea, because you can't get heavy vehicles over. Now, there were some talk that the Ukrainians were trying to build a pontoon bridge across, but people were saying that the pictures that were being shown of it were trying to geolocate it. Were saying, no, this isn't that part of the river. It's elsewhere. So I can't really say what's going on. But it's a thorn in the Russian side. It's something that they need to deal with. And again, this is part of a much larger plan of keep the Russian reserves running back and forth, dealing with little problems until conditions are right. Throw everything in when they can't react because they're out of position or their vehicles are broken down or they're tired or out of gas or what have you.
Zelensky was interviewed on U.S. media last week or this week, and he said that actually Russia is not the enemy. The enemy is time. What do you think he meant by that?
The enemy is time because Western aid, the longer this goes on, the less likely Western countries are going to be to continue to support Ukraine at the levels they have. Ukraine is suffering a lot, and they're going to, at some point, need to start thinking about foregoing some of the hardline demands of we want all our territory back, we want all our people back, we want reparations, etc. And the longer this draws on, the more pressure there is from the civilian side in Ukraine to say, look, we need to end this thing. We're suffering too much. Too many people have died. Too many buildings have been blown up.
All right. So yeah.
You know, it's not, doesn't look like it's happening yet, which is a good thing. But reality is the longer you prosecute a war, the more weary of that war your populace becomes. Unless, and even if, you're making gains on the battlefield.
Well, and I assume if they can't find a place to punch through past a certain point, it's going to get difficult to finish a major offensive before we start to once again have issues with the weather. Is that accurate, or is that just way too far away to even be thinking about that?
No, that's quite accurate. Starting in October, November timeframe, you're going to start seeing rain. Temperatures are going to drop. When the autumn rains come, the ground will turn to mush, the famous rasputitsa. Then it will have a freeze. Vehicles will be able to maneuver again, but winter warfare presents its own set of difficulties. It's who's prepared to fight in those conditions. I think, as Starsky said some time ago, this isn't going to end in 2023. This is going to go into 2024. So there will be another war through the winter. I'm assuming that this time the Russians will be a little better prepared for it, but who knows?
If we haven't seen a punch through on the main front lines, let's assume that we continue to see slow but steady progress on the front lines, but we don't see this punch through that we've been expecting. By when, if we don't see it, would you start to be concerned that they may not be able to accomplish the primary goals, what we assume, I should say, are the primary goals of the counteroffensive, if they haven't made that punch through by what time, do you think?
I would say that by the time we get into late September, you're hitting a point where the opportunity for a summer offensive to make significant gains is gone. There certainly is the possibility of doing that in the winter. It's just harder to do because of the conditions, but it can be done. In World War II, both sides conducted relatively good winter offensives. So,
all right. So, Anything else that you think either we've neglected to mention, or anything else that gives you either optimism or concern based on what you're seeing now?
We have the ongoing nagging issue of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Yes.
We have imagery now of the Russians placing what everybody is assuming are explosives on the roofs of the reactor buildings. We know from statements being made by people who work there that they wired the place to blow it up. So that would be a significant issue. There's been a lot of talk, about whether or not NATO might consider this grounds to invoke Article 5, because the fallout from any such a detonation of the power plant, all that fallout could potentially fall across NATO countries. Ergo, you could argue that was an attack. So who knows how NATO is going to react? Who knows if the Russians are going to actually blow the plant? It may be, I doubt it, but I'm going to say this, it may be that the Russians are setting up not to destroy the plant in such a way that radiation would leak out, but merely to cripple its ability to generate power for the Ukrainian industry. So that would be a valid act, I suppose you could say, but nonetheless, I don't think that's what they're up to. There is currently a delegation of former U.S. security personnel, so emphasis former, they're not currently with the government, who are supposedly engaged with talks with high-level Russians right now about potentially finding a way to end this. At least that's what people are presuming. We don't know what they're actually talking about. It could be just as well them saying, look, if you blow the power plant, here's our red line. Here's what we're going to do to you if you blow the power plant. Don't blow the power plant. But we don't know. If they are trying to negotiate with the Russians to try to find an exit for this situation, the obvious question that comes to my mind is, why aren't the Ukrainians involved? And it could be that, it'll be shuttle diplomacy. So they'll go and talk to the Russians and say, okay, what is your absolute minimum? And then they'll go to the Ukrainians and say, okay, here's what they want. Are you willing to accept it? No. How much can you give on what they've demanded? And you do it because the two sides can't talk to each other face to face. They loathe each other too much to do that. So somebody has to act as an intermediary. That may be what they're trying to do here.
Well, it's also possible, I would assume, that if the U.S. can provide something that it's willing to give up, that it thinks is important, it's important enough to end the war, that the U.S. may be willing to say, if you guys pull out, this is what we can give, including but not limited to ending the sanctions on the oligarchs, maybe providing the oligarchs opportunities in the U.S., which I would be against for reasons we've discussed before, but nonetheless may be offered, and saying, okay, and we're going to try to pull strings with the UN and come out and say that Putin is not guilty of war crimes for kidnapping children and yada, yada, yada. Do you think the U.S. would be interested in pursuing unilateral, even without Ukraine's involvement, pursuing some way to end the war in a direct negotiation between the U.S. and Russia?
I don't think we would do that. I think we would, at some point, even if we are attempting to find common ground with the Russians to do that, at some point the Ukrainians need to be brought into the discussions, because you're not ending the war if the Russians say, okay, and then the Ukrainians continue fighting. You have to get both parties to agree. But it's interesting that the potential that we are at the stage where negotiations are being considered, I think that's a positive step.
Well, and you had said earlier that you would consider what Russia is doing in Ukraine as genocide. We've talked about that, but one of the reasons for it is because of the displacement of Ukrainians who are being kidnapped and taken and forced to remote parts of Russia where they can't communicate with their friends or family and are being displaced in what appears to be an attempt to wipe out the entire Ukrainian culture. Even if the U.S. negotiated a ceasefire, B, a complete withdrawal of Russia from all of the occupied areas, and even a returning of Crimea to Ukraine, it seems to me that while that might, quote, end the war, you still have the problem of Russia holding a huge number of Ukrainian citizens, especially children, against their will in Russia, which the U.S. might not put at the forefront of any such negotiations. Is that reasonably accurate?
Yeah, I think that is very accurate. There are so many elements to what Ukraine considers inflexible demands that they're not going to deviate from it. You have to do this. We can't end the war until you do this. And as I've said from very, very early on, Putin needs to be offered an exit strategy where he comes out of this still looking like the strong man. Mm-hmm. He needs some way he can stand up proudly in Moscow and put up his mission accomplished banner on the bridge of the carrier. I won. Even though he didn't win, it lets you know that this is the message we're going to send. Because Russia pulling out of Ukraine now with the state of the military, with the horrendous number of casualties they've suffered, that's not going to fly. They have to have something that he can come away with, because everything really hinges on convincing Putin.
Well, and to some extent, though, too, that was almost what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, if memory serves, which is, by the time all was said and done, the U.S. actually lost ground because, yes, we removed the missiles in Cuba, but before this happened, there hadn't been missiles in Cuba, and in order to get those missiles out, we secretly gave up our missiles, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. So it looked very much at the time like the U.S. had won that engagement because Russia withdrew and it didn't cost the U.S. anything ostensibly. But in the end, yeah, it really did. So, it was...
it's a matter of saving face. It really is. And so Putin needs to be able to save face there.
So Khrushchev walked away with the actual win, and he was able to satisfy members of the Politburo to that, and because he could control the media, he could say whatever he wanted outside of that. But it looked very much like Kennedy won, and so okay, so something along those lines.
The flip side of that is Khrushchev continues to stay in power. If anything, his position after the Cuban Missile Crisis is enhanced. So what we sold as a victory for our own purposes really wasn't in any way a victory. But it was for the world because we didn't go into a nuclear Armageddon.
Do you think you could ballpark the odds of NATO getting involved if, and under these explicit conditions, if the Zaporizhzhia power plant was detonated in such a way as to be clear to be used as essentially a dirty bomb and irradiate the region?
I think I'm pushing the envelope here. I'll say 60-40, but in reality, I think it's more 50-50 as to whether NATO will do anything. But I think there's enough of a consensus, enough of concern of certain NATO members about this because they're right in the center of the damn fallout zone, Poland being the primary case, that they might consider unilateral action.
Poland itself may enter unilaterally, not as a NATO member, but as themselves. This would obviously not trigger Article 5.
Right. And it could be other countries too that join them that are upset enough by this, whereas certain NATO members just don't feel strong enough and don't join. So that falls under the aegis of Article 5. A lot of people don't understand that. Article 5 does not compel countries in NATO to join a war. It simply says that each country will contribute to defending everybody else. So let's say we go back to the Cold War period, Russia attacks West Germany. It doesn't mean that countries like Spain or Portugal actually need to send military forces to go fight in West Germany. They could instead have said, well, we'll send ammunition, we'll send supplies, we'll send people to do relief work to help with the refugees, but we don't want to get our forces involved in fighting. That still exists. So if certain countries decide, in this case, if Article 5 is invoked, to say, yeah, we're sending troops into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians, while others say, nah, we ain't going to go that far. That's still a possible scenario here.
There's been talk that Poland has actually been considering entering into this, despite not having been directly attacked. There was the missile that crashed. We discussed why we believe that was an accident. But that notwithstanding, how serious are they? How seriously do you think they're considering involving themselves into this war?
It's a political decision, and I, again, am not that tied in with Polish politics, but we do know that the Polish military is on the heightened alert, that a lot of forces have been brought up to full readiness position near the border, that reserves are being given additional training and new equipment is being purchased to re-equip significant portions of the Polish army. The issue is from the standpoint of, could Poland do something like that? Yes, absolutely. Would they? I don't know. But throw a dirty bomb into that scenario, which contaminates a significant portion of Polish territory, I could easily see them saying, the hell with it, we're going in.
All right, we've got a couple of super chats real quick before we do that. You know what? It was a great time to point out, if you like what we're doing, like, subscribe, and share it. Share it to people who are interested. I appreciate every now and then somebody's like, oh yeah, I spammed the show in like every channel I could find. And it's like, that's great if they're channels that are likely to be interested in the content, and you're not, if somebody doesn't want to see it, it doesn't help you, them, or us to send it out. But if you know somebody who'd be interested in it and you want to share it and say, hey, here's a show you guys might be interested in, that's a great way to help. It's free, helps us. So is hitting that like button. The reason you hear this from every single YouTuber is really simple. It really does actually help. It helps us in the algorithm. It helps the show. So it's a great way to show your support, and we appreciate it when you guys do that. So please do like, subscribe, and share. So as to super chats, $2 US, Daedalus Media. He being Putin can borrow George Bush's banner. Absolutely. I will find that banner, and I will send it to Putin if he will. We'll make him a new one. We'll make him a new one. Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll make another banner. Beware of open windows. But nonetheless, yeah, no, I think you're absolutely. Well, he can have George Bush's banner. He can absolutely. Good call. I love that one. So
only used once.
Only used once, yeah. Yvonne Way, member comment, slowly but surely Ukraine will win. I'm still obviously very, very optimistic about that. And I think, I said this before when this started, the brutality.
The thing that people don't realize, think people don't really realize is the Russians are now starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel. When you're sending 60 and 65-year-old pensioners to go fight in the trenches because you can't find any young men, that tells you how low the water level is in the little bathtub they're trying to float their boat.
I want to quickly plug two channels here. Rick the Ukrainian, who does the dubbing of the prisoners of war stories, and it was through a discussion on his Discord that I found, and he's a really good guy. I like him. He's been on here. I've been on his show. He's a good guy. But I found an interview, and to the best of my knowledge, he has not dubbed this one, but I found an interview with a 65-year-old POW. The guy is 65 years old, fighting on the side of the Russians. He was captured, and I'm sitting there reading some of the reports of the hardships on the front and realizing that 18 to 25-year-olds are finding it very difficult to survive there, just to function, to have enough food and water and to be able to get up and move fast enough to try to stay alive. And these are people at the height of their prime. And this 65-year-old guy captured by Russians because he couldn't really, pick up a rifle in time to arm himself. So they think he was able to be captured, and it's amazing. And anyways, on Rick's, they're talking about it. I don't know that that's one that Rick will eventually be able to dub, but yeah, it's amazing. They've still got a lot of people they can draw from, but all the quality ones that are really capable of fighting have from what we can tell, I think has been spent. The other one is... This
has an additional side effect that nobody considers, is as you send more and more people to fight at the front, you have fewer and fewer people in the rear to continue running industry. So the Russians are talking about, oh yeah, we're going to refit these old T-62 tanks and send them to the front. They're going to be just as good as a T-72 after we finish our upgrade. Except they closed one of the two production lines at the factory, and the other one's operating about half capacity because of a combination of lack of labor to run the equipment, because all the guys are at the front dying away, and lack of parts needed to accomplish what they want to upgrade these tanks. So yeah, it's like nobody is looking at this from a long-term perspective. They still are hoping for that sudden 3-day win. I think that's really what's going on in their minds here, is that somehow, magically, the Ukrainian army will suddenly shatter and collapse, and the stream to Kiev will be on. But that ain't going to happen.
Well, and we've seen a lot of fires, warehouse, industrial accidents in Russia. Some of it appears to be sabotage, but some of it that we've been able to learn more about appears to be somebody who had never worked with munitions before, who was an underage kid who they couldn't put him in the front line, so they said, "Here you go, you're going to work on this." Had no idea what he was doing, did something really crazy, and all of a sudden, caused a huge explosion. And there's been a lot more of that.
Yeah.
The other, yes,
we are
please.
Truly watching the implosion of Russia as one of the great powers as this war drags on. The longer it goes, the weaker they become.
So, I had wanted to mention, and my brain has already spaced why I was going to bring up the other one. We had been talking about surely. Ukraine will win. I think there have been, so I wanted to bring up two other channels. One was Rick the Ukrainian, just a sweetheart of a guy too. You see him stream, he's always smiling, and and you're sitting there watching a guy who's in a war zone and who I think really didn't give a shit about politics, and he's open and honest about that. And like Starsky wanted to start a gaming channel, and here they are doing this and making a difference. It's amazing to watch. And the other one is Mercado Media, who I actually had some awareness of previously, and then I streamed on the shills with them once briefly, didn't get much of a chance to chat with them. But they're in, Makrovna Media is currently in Ukraine right now and has been with Starsky and sort of showing people what's going on from that perspective. And there was something I wanted to say about that, and I've completely spaced what it was, aside from the fact it's impressive. And I think it's the kind of thing people need to do. I'm sorry, what?
I said, sorry, my bad.
Oh, no, not your bad at all. Because I think better to hear from you, and I wanted to hear what you said anyway. So it didn't. I'm a little scatterbrained Switzerland right now, and so I'm just easily distracted. More than Switzerland. Switzerland should be Switzerland. Anyways, so given that nobody's laughing at my jokes nearly as much as I'd like, let's so Yvonne, and then last one member for 3 months, Bjorn Hartmeier, Pooters needs to be made into Swiss cheese by NATO.
That would be lovely.
It would be lovely.
A little pastrami and some nice mustard. Oh, what a sandwich.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't think I'd go that far. I will, before we go, say one thing, Commander, which is I consider you a friend, and I have been delighted to get to know you, and we talk sometimes behind the scenes a bit, too, and sometimes when there's no show, you and I catch up, and I certainly enjoy doing that. But in terms of what this show is and what we try to do, we try to bring on people who know what they're talking about. If we can bring on nice, famous people and people who are, big up, that's always great. But the people who know what they're talking about and are willing to come on and to help educate us, that's always a plus. When you first came on, you said a number of things that I was just like, okay. You said the war was going to, you said the war was going to last years. And I was like, yeah, Ukraine will beat them in 6 months. You said that, removing Putin probably wouldn't necessarily solve the problem and could in fact make things worse. And I was just like, how can things get worse? And all of these things. And so I look at my views, how they were then and how they are now, and how much they've changed and how much I've been educated. And I think it's been an educational experience for both of us because we both go over the news and we talk about it. So I have
brainwashed you. My mission
so
is
you have
so-called
exactly. I am. There's a question. There was a question about that in the live chat. Nick, have you been brainwashed by Commander McMillan? Commander, have I been brainwashed?
If you say so.
Yeah, okay, no. Commander is telling me I haven't been brainwashed, so no, I'm not brainwashed. Because the commander has made it crystal clear I have not been brainwashed, so I don't know what you're talking about. So, but anyways, I wanted to thank you because I think
no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. So I wanted to thank you. I think you've made a huge contribution to this show and to our ability to help put all this thing in context. And what you had said about, or what got me thinking about it was the comment about the Putin being replaced, and I very much agree. But on the flip side, it's like I remember hearing that 2 years ago, really now, and saying, "Oh yeah, all their problems are over as soon as Putin's replaced," and now having a much more nuance. It's like, yeah, I'd like to see it, but unfortunately, understanding Russian current political structure now better than I did. But the reason I do is because of you. So thank you for that. I'm in an enviable position where I get to take all the knowledge and then I go onto other streams and I start talking about these things. Like, how do you know so much? I was born that way. I was born knowing everything. You weren't? So thank you. Anyways, let's see. We've got $2 depleted uranium cowboy. MMGGS. I'm sure that means something, but I don't know what, so I do apologize. $10, Mr. Diggs. Thank you, gentlemen, for Starsky's Troop. Thank you, sir. We really appreciate the super chat, and we will pass that along. And last one, Mr. E30, member chat. So Nick, on the other hand, and I quote, McMillan has rubbed off on, oh, Jesus. Look, it's not like I'm a hippo or nothing.
I'm sorry, Nick. I've ruined you for life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Yvonne Way. Yvonne Way, 5 Swiss francs. Thank you so much for that one. I think I've finally learned that one. I haven't gotten Sorry, I'm excluding you from NATO. 5 Swiss francs. I got the currency at least, so now I'll try to get like the actual country down, and maybe I'll be qualified to run a news program. Thank you all very much for your help and your support. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Commander McMillan. Unless I'm missing, I think we covered everything, so I want to just double check. Was there any last minute you wanted to say, or you think we're good here?
I think we've covered all the key parts that we need to. I will note one thing that people may have seen the video of. I think we talked about it last week, if I recall. There's a horrific video, and it really is horrific. You don't want to watch it if you don't really care about these things. But there's a Ukrainian group in a Bradley trying to rescue some guys of theirs who have gone into a minefield. And they keep trying to, reach over and just take one step on the ground to get these guys through the minefield and bring them on to safety on board Bradley. And they keep hitting more mines and just getting ripped to shreds. Without going into detail, one guy towards the end of this film clip suffers just a hideous injury. I just wanted to say we found out he survived and he's in hospital.
Thank you for that. I haven't checked the NSFW. Yeah. Is it not NSFW? It's explicit on Ukraine channel
right,
in the last
explicit.
24 hours. But I assume it's is that in the explicit on the Discord?
Yeah, and yes, it is. And do not view it lightly. That's all I will say. I've seen some pretty horrific stuff, and even for me, that was like, oh God damn.
So that's on our Discord, and you have to opt in to get access to that channel. Anyone who wants to can, but obviously, that's you have to choose. Killer Rabbit for $2. Just call me Killer Rabbit. Leave off the rest. You, sir, are a hero. Thank you. All right.
Carabano thanks you as well for not having to have him mangle the name every time.
You know what? All right, hold on. Do I still have access to your shield? Okay, yeah, I'm going to close your shield. I'm going to close your shield. We've heard enough from you, and that was the wrong button. By the way, if there's anybody watching this who knows how to produce a YouTube news channel, who wants to produce it and hit buttons, I'm asking. No reason, just asking. Reach out and say hello. All right, thank you all for joining us, and we will have a light schedule, I think, for the next week and a half. You can find out more about that on the Discord right now. The next scheduled program is Downtime for a week from yesterday, and Starsky again a week from today. But again, we'll be updating on the Discord as that progresses. We do have some guests that we're talking to, would like to have on for our regular Tuesday show, but we'll talk about it. It'll be on our Discord. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you again, Commander, and see you next time.
Take care.